Chapter 2. The Pre-Gould Erie. In October 1867, press dispatches carried the news that Jay Gould had been elected a member of the Erie Board of Directors. Gould was just past age 31, unknown in financial and business circles. However, his election was the beginning of a career that for a quarter of a century repeatedly stirred, stormed, and shocked the financial and business world. The Erie in 1867 was in a difficult strategic and financial situation. Its position was the outgrowth of 15 years of evolution. The road was conceived as an ocean to the lakes carrier for the purpose of meeting the market needs of New York City and southern New York State. In this lay both strength and weakness. The state had advanced the road $3 million, but by the middle 40s, this investment was lost. With the further aid of public credit and wide use of private credit, the line was completed to Lake Erie at Dunkirk in the summer of 1851. No railroad up to that time had been built on such a comprehensive scale. Because of political considerations, however, the road was not built in accordance with strategic requirements. Since the Erie was the recipient of public aid from the state of New York, it was considered necessary so far as possible to confine its lines within the state. Despite the existence of sources of valuable traffic in the northern part of Pennsylvania, the Erie was originally constructed closely hugged the southern boundary of New York. Due also to the interplay of local political forces, the line at its western terminus did not reach the important traffic gateways of Erie and Buffalo, but only then relatively unimportant community of Dunkirk. Neither did it reach other important lake outlets. The truth is, said a leading railroad journal of the day, the moment the Erie Company was out of New York, it was out of doors. Finally, the route in southern New York, selected partly because of local political influences, gave the Erie poor grades and made it, for many years, quote, an expensive line to work, end quote. The road, nevertheless, had excellent traffic possibilities. In November 1853, just as its first major problems as the completed railroad were becoming critical, the Board of Directors issued a reassuring communication to the stockholders. The Erie, according to the management, had no competing water lines for the greater portion of its business. Its resources were largely increased by the contributions of many tributary roads, which, like the country it penetrates, have no other direct outlet to the market, and it lies in the direct line of the greatest trade and travel which exists on the continent, which with its terminus at the focus of that trade. Stressing the Erie's location, the circular pointed out that the lateral tributary roads, except for the three mostly easterly ones, converged from north or south towards the Erie and had no other outlet. Short of the construction of a parallel road, a probability which was nearly or quite impracticably, there could be no diversion of the business which these tributaries would throw to the Erie. The Erie concluded the management in operation must receive the business of all lines, without fear of diversion or competition, thus giving stockholders, quote, a guarantee that they will receive an early and ample remuneration of their investment, end quote. These flattering possibilities contained some truth. The lateral roads were there, the traffic was there, and constantly increasing, and there were no other through lines from lake to ocean. The New York Central from Albany to Buffalo was then in process of organization, and its future could not be foreseen. The Erie's possibilities were, however, immediately clouded by financial management, and in 1854, Daniel Drew was appointed treasurer to succeed the much criticized incumbent. Drew was skilled in the art of handling conflicting corporate interests. Shortly after his assumption of office, and in return for his endorsement of some corporate paper, he took a mortgage on all the road's property. In spite of his financial aid, the road remained on the verge of failure. In the face of the panic break of 1857, the Erie was again helpless, and on September 1st of that year, Wall Street was in a state of delightful excitement. The company needed $600,000 to pay interest on the second and third mortgage bonds. With the road's mortgage still in his possession, Drew had, so he so desired, could have taken possession of the Erie. In spite of liberal terms, the road could make no further loans from individuals, and only at the last moment was it able to secure the help it needed from the banks. The reason for Drew's forbearance was not clear, although the report that Drew had made advances to the company in exchange for a pledge of 5,000 shares of Erie stock, and that he had bought and sold and traded the stock affords some clues. A new management assumed office after the crisis of 1857. It learned that capital improvements had been financed by short-term obligations. The road, because of the increase in business, had found it necessary to make terminal improvements, but the traffic expansion upon which the terminal improvements were predicated suddenly ceased late in 1857. The company again needed help, and it accordingly executed a chattel mortgage to its ever-willing treasurer, Drew, to secure a 6-month loan of $1.5 million. The loan, according to the newly elected president, had, quote, completely destroyed the credit of the company as soon as known, end quote. And the road, after meeting its September interest payments, permitted its floating debt to go to protest in October. The president, who had criticized the financial practices of his predecessor, made determined attempts to solve the company's financial problems. Repeated appeals made to stockholders resulted in securing funds of less than $30,000 in the face of a liberal offer of $2,000 of fourth mortgage bonds for every $1,000 advance. The floating debt was somewhat reduced, though. Drew's holds on the Erie, through his possession of a chattel mortgage, was not removed. In violation of a provision of this loan, Drew acted prematurely, initiated receivership proceedings in the late summer of 1859. The Erie reorganization of January 1862 was careful of the rights of security holders. The financial structure, which had caused so much trouble, remained substantially untouched. The unsecured bonds, together with the accrued unpaid interest, were converted into preferred stock, and the property was left with a funded debt of almost $20 million, common stock of more than $11 million, and a new preferred stock of $8,536,000. In the following 2 years, partly because of war inflation, the road prospered. In the spring of 1864, the able wartime president, Nathaniel Marsh, died. During his administration, the road's traffic had been tripled. A new short line to Buffalo had been acquired. The valuable Long Dock property had been completed. An entrance to the Pennsylvania coal fields had been secured. The floating debt had been paid, and the mortgage debt reduced by several $1 million. Marsh had done his work well. Even now, with the passage of time, it is difficult to judge how much of the road's prosperity was permanent and how much of the effect of temporary conditions. In part, it came from wartime forces. The rate-cutting wars, which had demoralized truck line earnings between 1857 and 1860, had ceased, only to be renewed after the war on a larger scale. Another contributing, though temporary, factor was the heavy flow of eastbound oil traffic from the newly discovered oil regions in Pennsylvania. The oil traffic first began to affect the Erie's earnings in 1862. Although the Erie did not touch the oil fields, it did connect with the newly completed Atlantic and Great Western Railroad, a property that was destined to exert a far-reaching influence upon the fortunes of the Erie, the New York Central, and the Pennsylvania, and which for the next 3 years loomed up on the railroad horizon as one of its most brilliant constellations. When oil was discovered in Pennsylvania in 1859, the eastern roads had no wholly owned or controlled connections to the west, beyond Buffalo and Pittsburgh. Of the 3 major eastern lines, only the Pennsylvania had taken steps to expand west. Though it recognized the importance of western outlets, it nevertheless hesitated to assume major financial responsibilities in acquiring such outlets. Through its president, J. Edgar Thompson, it had succeeded in extricating one of these western lines controlling a route to Chicago from a serious financial embarrassment. The Pennsylvania guided the road, the Pittsburgh, Fort Wayne, and Chicago, through receivership, but later sold the shares it had acquired in the reorganization. Another route to Chicago lay on the southern shore of Lake Erie, from Buffalo to Chicago, and was controlled by a number of companies. Despite the discovery of oil and the resultant increase in traffic, little construction by the eastern truck lines followed. The decline in business after the Panic of 1857 destroyed more traffic than the discovery of oil created. When military hostilities ushered in an extraordinary business expansion, little railroad building took place. Prices of materials were high, and the supply of labor diminished by wartime enlistment and the diversion to military production. One major route, however, was built. It served the Pennsylvania oil region. Promoters had long been at work on an interior route from southwestern New York across northwestern Pennsylvania to the lakes. By further building and by connections with other roads, a new through route with the Mississippi and Ohio valleys could thus be established. This route, penetrating the Pennsylvania oil fields, was completed by James McHenry, a successful English businessman and promoter, through the building of the Atlantic. Soon after its completion, the road entered into a 5-year traffic contract with the Erie. The new road, because of its large oil traffic, was immediately profitable, and its oil business was a major factor in fattening the earnings of the Erie from 1862 to 1865. In addition to the oil traffic, the Atlantic's strategic location brought the businesses of many other connections to the Erie. The Atlantic in 1865 was thus a segment of a route reaching Cincinnati and St. Louis, with connections to Cleveland, Toledo, and Erie. It also controlled most of the country's oil traffic. Little wonder, then, that observers were hopeful for its future. In view of its contract with the Erie, neither is it to be wondered that the optimism extended to that road. The Atlantic's connection was indeed of the highest importance to the Erie and Marsh. The president of the latter did not overlook its probable value. Besides contracting to pay the new line a bonus for eastbound traffic, he also made arrangements just prior to his death to procure a large increase in the supply of rolling stock in order to take care of future growth. An agreement was reached, whether by Marsh or his successor on behalf of the Erie is not clear, to supply the Atlantic with $5 million of rolling stock. The first published reference made to this contract appeared in a prospectus of the Atlantic's second mortgage bonds, issued in London in the fall of 1864. Early in the following year, that London directors of the road listened to the report from an American representative. to the effect that the Erie was fulfilling its promise to supply rolling stock in accordance with the contract. To carry out this agreement, the Erie was again obligated to borrow, and by 1864, it was indebted to Drew for almost $2 million. The loans being secured by 28,000 shares of the Erie. The Erie's floating debt now totaled $3,624,000. Informed observers were unable to understand why the Erie could not manage its affairs without continuous borrowings. When, in the fall of 1865, for example, a report spread that the Erie had made a loan of several millions abroad to pay a debt to an unnamed person, probably Drew, surprise was expressed. Quote, "It is really remarkable," end quote, declared a railroad periodical, quote, "that this road," referring to the Erie, "doubled in value by its connection with the Atlantic and Great Western, should flounder around as it does, notwithstanding its enormous receipts," end quote. A break in the friendly relations with the Erie soon led the Atlantic to decide on a plan of construction and acquisition for creating a rival route to the seaboard. The London financial crisis of 1866 blocked its plans and left the road with a dangerously high floating debt. In the midst of these financial reserves, the Atlantic was suddenly confounded by a new problem. Its most important business, oil, was threatened by railroad competition, and its monopoly of the traffic was soon lost. By the summer of 1866, the Pennsylvania Railroad had finished its connection via a controlled line, the Philadelphia and Erie, to Oil City. This new route from the oil regions to New York City was shorter than the Atlantic Erie route. In order to hold the business against its powerful competition, the Atlantic began a program of rate cutting, thus initiating the policy which had far-reaching effects a few years later on the growth of the Standard Oil Company. The cuts were reflected in a drop in the average rate per ton on the Atlantic from $3.70 in 1865 to $2.87 in 1866, despite the fact that the tonnage increased almost 50%. Its earnings showed heavy declines. The cutting of rates on oil traffic continued in 1867. In the fall of that year, competition between the Atlantic and the Pennsylvania's line in the oil region broke rates from $2.60 to $1.44 per barrel, although later in the year the rates were increased. Similarly, on the Erie, the deflation of 1866, accompanied by sharp rate cuts in the first 6 months of the year, produced reversals in earnings. The road, nevertheless, according to the president, was never in better condition to transact any business offered. The investors, however, were not so well pleased. Quote, "It cannot be disguised," wrote one observer, "that very great uneasiness prevails in interested circles with regard to the condition of the road." End quote. The business decline in 1866, together with heavy fixed charges that had been incurred to buy the new equipment for which there was now little use, as well as the poor physical condition of the roadbed, served to increase expenses in the face of a decline in gross. The company's floating debt again increased, and in May 1866, approximately $3.5 million. The Erie's finances were going from bad to worse. The company did not have funds to pay its employees, and its commercial paper was about to go to protest. While the Erie was floundering in a mass of floating obligations accumulated in consequence of its western connection, it was also preparing the way for further financial problems because of its eastern connections. The Erie had no controlled rail outlets to New England. The traffic from southern New England, the most populous part of the area, moved to New York City over the New York and New Haven. In November 1865, a corporation interested in the building of a line west to the Hudson River, the Boston, Hartford, and Erie, asked the Erie for help. Here was an opportunity for the Erie. A New England extension opened up the possibility of a large anthratic movement from northwest Pennsylvania. However, there was also a risk. The Erie's financial obligations were heavy, and additional commitments could not be lightly undertaken. For more than a year, nothing was done. The Boston, meanwhile, applied for aid also from two anthratic-producing companies, though this request proved similarly unavailing. It was not until the spring of 1867 that the Boston obtained help. An understanding was finally reached that if the state of Massachusetts lent $3 million in state scrip, the Erie and the coal companies would supply $6 million. The coal companies, for some unexplained reason, were not willing to extend aid to the Boston. In April 1867, a law was passed providing a loan of $3 million scrip, secured by a $4 million of the Boston's bond. Shortly after the passage of the law, John S. Eldridge, president of the Boston, appeared before the Erie's executive committee with a proposal for an Erie's guarantee of $6 million of the Boston's bond. The Erie management was cautious and was not prepared to plunge. There are advantages and disadvantages. On the favorable side, the completed route, which would probably give the Erie an annual gross of $2 million, was described as most direct, but with very few curves and steep grades. Between the Hudson River and Boston, it would cross 11 railroads, thus facilitating the delivery of freight received from the Erie, while it would also bring much western trade to Boston and divert it from the route through New York Harbor. Anthratic coal would be carried by a short, non-congested rail route, as compared with the relatively circuitous route via Philadelphia and steamship beyond. There were also disadvantages. The cost of any project, no matter how attractive, may be excessive, and such was the case, not only with the Atlantic, but also with the Boston. To the north of the proposed line was the well-established Boston and Albany, connecting with the prosperous New York Central. The former, with more than half of its line double-tracked, with superior buildings and depot, and with a line fully equipped, costing $17 million, compared with the proposed capital liability of $40 million, split evenly between stocks and bonds for the Boston. In view of these conflicting considerations, the Erie's executive committee hesitated. It was prepared to recommend to the board that the Erie should guarantee $140,000 annually on the Boston's bonds for 1867 and also for 1868, subject, however, to numerous provisos. The Boston must sell enough bonds to finish the line to the Hudson River. It must make satisfactory arrangements to pay interest on the bonds until the road was finished. It must set aside enough of its gross revenues to meet the Erie's guarantee, and it must permit the Erie to fix rates and fares on interchange business and on coal traffic moving east from the Hudson River. Eldridge, in order to force the hand of the Erie and to compel it to come more actively to the support of the Boston, accordingly decided to buy Erie stock and get control. The picture was complicated. Cornelius Vanderbilt, who, by this time, had almost completed his control of the railroad, triumvirate consisting of the New York and Harlem, the Hudson River, and the New York Central, had bought heavily into the Erie. Control of that road would give him monopoly of all railroad truck lines entering New York City from the west. Vanderbilt therefore conducted a campaign for proxies, and Eldridge joined up with Drew to conduct a rival proxy fight. The Eldridge agent, however, sold out to Vanderbilt in a surprise move. Gould, at the time, was like Drew, a stockbroker. Although much of the Erie stock was held in the names of stockbrokers, the actual owners were others, many of whom were residents of England. They had not transferred the stock to their names, and title was transferred from one buyer to another by power of attorney. The right to vote the stock, since title was held in the name of the broker, was the property of the latter. Although Gould, as a broker, controlled Erie proxies, he did not have enough votes to ensure control, but he apparently had enough to make it worthwhile to Enridge. Even though Enridge's agents sold out to Vanderbilt, Enridge threw his support to Gould. And so, in the midst of these complicated and conflicting cross deals, a part of the old board of the Erie retired in October 1867, and a new group was added. In the overturn, Drew was dropped as a member of the board and replaced by a non-entity. But within the next few days, the latter resigned from the board, and Drew took his place. What persuasive arguments Drew presented to Vanderbilt to permit the change are not known. The new Erie board, thus elected in the fall of 1867, was presumed to be Vanderbilt control. The public eye was upon Vanderbilt and Drew. For many years, alternatively, his associate and opponent, both in the navigation, the railroad, and the stock speculating business. Yet, the financial press, the newspapers, and the railroad commentators, all relatively uninformed outsiders, were mistaken in their estimate of the controlling personalities. Drew, it is true, was preparing for a new stock market foray, similar to the one the year before in which he had made such a quick profit. Therefore, in the battle of injunctions which soon followed, Vanderbilt sought to stop Drew. Vanderbilt's dangerous opponent was not Drew. Vanderbilt had overlooked the ingenious Gould. With all his sources of information, he was not able to detect his major foe for control of the Erie until it was too late. Gould thus came to the Directorate of the Erie at a time when its major western connection, the Atlantic, had gone into receivership. To balance this loss, the Erie apparently gained a valuable ally, the Boston, on the east. The Erie's newly elected president was Eldridge, the very man who was most interested in this eastern connection. In fact, his primary interest lay in that property. The finances of the Erie, furthermore, with a floating debt of $6 million, were bad. The road also was about to encounter for the first time the competition of a consolidated, singly controlled truck line from New York City to Buffalo. The Erie's board was seemingly dominated by Vanderbilt, who also controlled the new competitive lake-to-ocean truck line. Even though the Erie's traffic was large, its earnings were poor, and its property was in disreputable physical condition. Though the road seemed to have an uncertain future, the Vanderbilt influence promised to enhance its value. Vanderbilt had multiplied the market price of the Hudson River and the Harlem stocks. He might do the same with Erie's. Strong cross-currents were at work, and diverse interests were endeavoring to acquire control for diverse purposes. In this competitive and speculative conflict, Gould emerged as the dominant personality.